and we are back with episode 3 of Things That Changed My Life. I would like to continue on with something that has shaped quite a large portion of my life, and that is Pokemon. Now, this episode is bound to be a little bit spicy, and a lot of people probably won't agree with me on some points, but that's my video. Pokemon is, it has been quite an important franchise in my life since I was extremely young. It was something I did competitively for a while and was something that I generally enjoyed and still enjoy to this day. I think this definitely started off with the Pokemon movies because I did not have, when I had a Game Boy, I was not playing Pokemon games. I remember I actually owned the first movie with Mewtwo, which had the it had that like bonus scene music videos. At the time when I got DVDs, I loved going into the bonus features, as well as the Lugia movie. To this day, I still have no idea what happened to my Mewtwo movie case. For some reason I cannot find it, but my Lugia one is still in my collection. So all my exposure to Pokemon as a kid was through movies at the time, until when I was gifted a Game Boy Advance SP, I was actually given 5 games. Now, I played Fire Red while my mother played Leaf Green. And to be quite fair, I have tried to keep a lot of her Pokemon alive. One that I have and I really hold on to is this Rhyperior. So at the time, there was only Rhydon, and I don't know if Rhydon was her favorite Pokemon. It was just a Pokemon that I always noticed was in the game that she would always pick, and so I've always kept it, even in newer games. But back to the timeline. So for a long time, there was actually quite a few Pokemon games that I didn't know of, such as like the XD Gale of Darkness, because I wasn't really old enough to have a GameCube, or it was one of those things where I didn't have consoles until I sort of understood what consoles were and how to use them. So things like GameCubes and like PlayStations weren't really something that I got unless like my mother wanted it, that sort of thing. Now, I think as someone who is like, when you play Pokemon, the standard thing is that you just go from one game next to next all the way. And I essentially did that. I would say I was actively like Pokemon for a long time. If you remember me saying in my fighting game video that I had taken a very long break from fighting games, and during this time a lot of my time was actually spent on Pokemon and competitive Pokemon. Since around Black and White, that is where I started to sort of understand competitive a little bit more, and I had actually been taken down to Birmingham for, I think it was I don't think it's regionals, it's one of them, you know what I mean. My dad took me. My dad probably doesn't know how much I really appreciate that, but to this day I appreciate that. I hope he sees this. I'll probably send it to him or something. If I end up finding any images from when we went down to that, I will put them in, but if not, you know that I didn't find it. But going back to the whole timeline, so essentially, you go from Fire Red, Gen 3, Gen 4, and here's the thing, I was a really big subscriber of the Nintendo magazine. So like I said before, no internet, we're finding out all our information through magazines. So when there was actually this one time where they was giving away, I think it was an E3 disc, and I think it was in the Nintendo magazine, and so it covered what was going to be on the Wii and it covered what was going to be on the DS coming up. And I remember seeing the first actual teaser like trailer of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and I was just like, this looks good. Also, I remember that for a long time it felt like we were stuck on Emerald for a very long time. Don't get me wrong, Emerald is a great game and possibly the best game from the GBA era, but it felt like we was on the GBA era for a long time. And then when Diamond and Pearl came out, very excited, spent way too much time. Like, I think if you were to combine my hours from Emerald and Diamond, it's probably more than 2,000 hours combined. Not to mention that I did end up restarting my Emerald like a couple of years ago. And another very important thing that happened to me when I was playing Emerald at the time as well was that they had I think it was their 10-year anniversary, and it was when they were giving away, like the legendary dogs, the birds, the airplanes, Pikachu and Charizard, all that kind of stuff. Really, because at this point in time, there were a number of Pokemon that you could not get from the Johto region because they were just not made available. So that was always a fun thing. And to this day, I understand why people may have been very upset at Pokemon because it was one of those things where if you were playing since the 90s, there was just a bit where you could not transfer your Pokemon over, so I can see why that would be incredibly frustrating. But continuing on, I would say this is probably where Pokemon was at its strongest, because you had Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, you had Soul Silver, Heart Gold, you had Pokemon Ranger, Conquest. There were a lot of spin-off games that were generally having much more successful storylines in terms of just how the storyline and the storytelling was done within the Pokemon universe, because Pokemon in general is not a game that is known for its for its strong storytelling. It's just never been that thing. It's always been a sort of, you go in, you play the game, and then you collect them all, which will also be a point of contention later on. We go from Diamond and Pearl, we go to Platinum, we go to Heart Gold, we go to Soul Silver, and it really started to feel like, okay, we can really start to get every Pokemon now. And then I remember the Darkrai movie came out, and that was quite a big thing, because going back to the Woolworths, rest in peace Woolworths, they had a Darkrai event, and I had gotten Darkrai from that. And not to mention, around this time as well, on the Wii, there was Pokemon Battle Revolution, which really revolutionized how we looked at Pokemon. And it's really funny looking at this now, seeing that. And this isn't just Pokemon, a number of game developers have done this thing where we've sort of stepped back in terms of progress, where you can see that it was all about sort of trying to push the boundaries back at like around the early 2010 sort of thing. And for Pokemon, they were really doing it with Battle Revolution. After that, it was like there was very little attempt to really try push past that. And even now, I would say, I would question if they have even come close to that sort of development. You had Black and White come into the equation, you had Black and White 2 come into the whole thing. It just seemed like everything was just going on the up and up for Pokemon. You know, there was a whole lot more animated specials now. They had a whole lot more movies to like tie in with a lot of the newer Pokemon coming in. It was really looking strong. And then I would say once we got the trailers for X and Y, because you know the 3DS was the big thing at the time, and so everyone was big on, oh my god, it's the first like handheld 3D game, and that was a really big deal for people. I remember the leaks were at an all-time high. You see, every time that there's a new Pokemon, there was always like a new Pokemon game being shown off. There was always like fans online that were dedicated to making like fake leaks, fake mon, all these different things to sort of try to trick people and be like, hey, this is what's coming. And I remember with X and Y, and then the one afterwards, which was Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which is a remake of Ruby and Sapphire, obviously, there was a whole lot of leaks, way too many. And here's the thing, I would say in general, X and Y was a really big success. You can tell how big X was because it's like, I think even now on my channel, I had gotten like Pokemon X like a day earlier, and I was like, here's the location of stuff and all that. And not to mention Mega Evolution as well, that really pushed the hype for the game as well. The reason why I find X and Y to be in this sort of position of development is because it was at a stage where, because there were so many new things that had to be made for the game, people weren't really surprised when they were like, hey, not every Pokemon is available in the game immediately, but we're going to make it so that you will have access to them later on, which will lead to the whole Pokemon Bank thing. Now, this at the time, this was not a big deal. I think you had to pay £5 to have access to Pokemon Bank, and this was just to bring like all your Pokemon from the DS era to the 3DS era, which was fine. And I think that was every Pokemon. I think it was every single one. And the biggest thing of Pokemon, and really hold on to this, the biggest thing of Pokemon, as I'm sure everyone watching this will know, is gotta catch them all. So, you know, constant like going from X and Y, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the whole thing was sort of catch them all. And then sort of came like the really weird part where Sun and Moon was shown off, and I don't know if the hype was really quite there. I enjoyed it, so I wasn't too bothered. And then you had like, I think a year later, you had Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and this is when I think people started to realize that this, like, waiting a year later to get a better version was not it, especially when Sun and Moon already wasn't amazing. I think it lacked a lot of stuff that Ultra Sun and Moon added, and it felt more of like a, we're gonna release this, and then we're gonna, because we know that we're known for releasing a better version later on, we're just gonna release the full thing then. And I think that's what left a bad taste in people's mouths. I think people were overly dramatic about how, and like just not being a good rival. I think there was not to say that he was good, he was boring. A lot of the rivals going from this point on, they were boring. But I think the thing was that Pokemon tried to shift to a more story-based sort of thing now, and I'm just gonna say I don't think it worked. I think it slightly had mild success, but I think overall it kind of fell flat. Then we have Sword and Shield being shown off for the Nintendo Switch. Honestly, I was kind of like, meh, it looked fine. I don't remember having any strong opinions on it. I just remember being like, it's a Pokemon game, it looks good. As long as all the Pokemon are here, I don't think I'll have any issues.
Well.
My first idea was, okay, so we're just gonna do like another Pokemon Bank situation sort of thing, which is like, here's the thing, it's fine to say that if not every Pokemon's going to be in, but they also said this, that hey, not everyone's going to be in because all these other Pokemon are going to have much more animations and they're going to be much more expressive.
With a lie detector determined that was a lie.
And here's the thing, I am all for supporting something if you love it. However, I do not agree with blindly looking at something and say, no, this is great. What are we talking about? Like many of these people did. There was a lot of delusion going around at the time, which was making zero sense. With a lot of people saying that, oh, this is going to highlight other Pokemon. This is going to do so much. It didn't do anything. All this did was make people angry, and here's the thing, I have not bought the Switch games. Someone else bought them for me, well, my mom bought them for me because she knows how much I love Pokemon, so that was like the whole thing. She didn't know what else to get me, so that is what she knew that I might like, and so she just like, I didn't know what to get you for like Christmas, so I didn't know what to get you for your birthday, so I got you Pokemon, because I know you like that. And it just felt like a constant excuse, and I don't even know whose decision it was, especially when later on that they're like, hey, we're gonna add most of the Pokemon into Sword and Shield, but you had to do it through like, you had to buy the DLCs. I understand that you didn't have to buy the DLCs, but if you wanted to catch them, usually you'd have to buy the DLCs and all this extra stuff, and it ended up just becoming like a scheme for money. And there were also a lot of questionable quotes just said by the person who was in charge of the Pokemon games, or I think the director of the Pokemon games at the time. There was just a lot of questionable quotes that were coming out, and it was just like, what are you talking about? And I recall saying this in a previous episode where there was this whole Twitter thing of where it was like, there was like, thank you Game Freak, but before that, I don't know if it was like, fuck you Game Freak, or if it was something else, but like, people were not happy, and I feel like that was justified. But then the goobers who came over here acting like what they changed for Sword and Shield were amazing and groundbreaking, despite Sword and Shield being probably the most polarizing Pokemon game to release to this date, because so many people hate it, and I don't want to say people loved it, because honestly the people who said that they love Sword and Shield, I feel are liars. The story was, what story? There wasn't much of a story, because they tried to like have you pair up and have these certain rivals, but then they had this constant thing of things were happening in the background. But then as soon as your character would want to get involved, they're like, oh no, go continue with your journey. And so you actually end up doing, like your character ends up doing very much nothing, and you have zero involvement until like the last final part of it, where you are fighting this big monster at the end of it. Not to mention at this point in time as well, we just saw that the game was losing more features than anything. We had last Mega Evolution, which, here's the thing, Mega Evolution had come in to make some Pokemon more viable. So if they were getting rid of Pokemon that they knew weren't gonna do anything for like the competitive meta, that would be fine. But they added these Pokemon anyway, knowing that, quite frankly, they wouldn't do anything. And I think that was the biggest issue as well. A lot of Pokemon were kept in Sword and Shield despite them having very little presence. And here's the thing, all of these Pokemon is someone's favorite. You have to make it make sense to a degree as well. It needs to make sense as to why you are making certain decisions to keep Pokemon in and keep Pokemon out, because these were questionable at best. Then we had Scarlet and Violet, where it was a very similar situation. Not so much in the story, I feel like the story was the only thing that went successfully for Scarlet and Violet, but that's not saying much considering the entire best part of it was the last hour. Everything else was just standard Pokemon, which is fine, but when you're basing a whole game around it and it just doesn't succeed, then you're flopping. Scarlet and Violet had a similar issue with it's not called Pokemon Banks now, is it? It's called something else, where it's essentially just trying to turn your hobby into like something you pay for, and you have to like constantly hold these Pokemon in this sort of app. And I think the biggest issue is that because even in Scarlet and Violet, even when they had announced like DLC, they didn't say all the Pokemon were going to be available. And then the issue with that is that, you know, I'm paying to keep these Pokemon in this thing, and it's like I can't even bring them over to a game that I'm playing at the moment. Let's stop trying to act like they did something completely crazy and spectacular with Scarlet and Violet, because I feel like people lose their critical thinking when you start talking about something that has been a part of their lives for a little bit of time. And don't even get me started on the Diamond and Pearl remake and the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Diamond and Pearl as the remake, oh my god, pieces of actual garbage. And I think the reason is because they tried to sort of replicate that sort of art style while still being 3D at the same time, which caused its own problems. But it's also like they had changed everything to be more chibi like in the overworld, which people didn't like at all. And there's even like a dedicated modding scene, because it's like, quite frankly, the modders shouldn't have to do what the developers couldn't. Modders should be there to, you know, make the already existing gaming experience better, but the gaming experience should already be decent to begin with. I think I'm gonna end it off on this note, on that the only thing that brings me any sort of joy when it comes to Pokemon is playing fan games now. I feel like playing Pokemon mods is sort of the way to go. I've played, like, me and Kura, we have played so many of these mods to the degree of like the storytelling is just so beyond. And you know, we're not dealing with an indie company, we're dealing with a multi-billion, I don't want to say dollar, they're just making millions, they're making billions probably. And I know that they can hire some writers in there to give us something, and maybe they could ask another company to help make them make a better mainline game, because I feel like that is what is needed as well. I feel like the constant need to move forward and make things look better has sort of been lost a little bit on, well, I don't really know what they're doing at the moment. But hey, at least Little Town Hero was a success, right? You've reached the end of the video and hopefully you liked it. If you didn't, tell me that you didn't in the comments, or just dislike it. I don't know, I don't care. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon that will be in the description below. And I think that's all. I will see you in the next video.